For this video, we're going to be talking about population, industry, and how those two impact each other and how that might change a community. We're going to talk about the relationship between urbanization, industrialization, and transportation. So when we think back to in a settlement in a community, people need to meet their basic needs. And if they can't provide those resources for themselves, either by growing food or building their own homes and things like that, they need to have economic opportunity where they can gain wealth to then purchase and seek out those resources. So industrialization and the idea of factories and the mass production of products led to movement of people looking for work. So and oftentimes there's sort of a central area where that industrialization happens, and it starts to develop into a concentrated or a high density population, turns into a city. And so people are drawn to that location because it is a place where they can access work and they can have wealth, and then they have more opportunities to meet their basic needs and to improve the quality of life of their family. So when we see this industrialization, we see this movement of people towards cities for work, which then cities then sometimes struggle with the resources that are available, because where they had designed their roads and their services and things to provide for a certain amount of people, now they have this influx, and so they have to adjust. So then that leads to urbanization, right? So urbanization, your city starts to grow, and it links also to your transportation, because everyone can't live in the city. So you improve transportation, you improve roads so that people can live further away, but now they're traveling a great distance to get to work. And as the community expands, it takes up land, and essentially that land would have been used for food, so eliminating food land. And so that's taken over for residents and more industry. And so there's this spreading of that urbanization that happens. And then it impacts transportation, because we have to have movement of people in and out. We have to have the movement of goods in and out. So we've got to build roads and roadways. We have to improve the existing structure that we have. And then those communities that have connections, that are able to get raw materials and get a workforce in and get materials out, those places survive, and that continues that urbanization, industrialization. Those communities that do not have those connections based on transportation really suffer, and their populations start to decrease, and their communities essentially kind of die. So we can see how this is sort of constantly working together and how they influence each other, and how there are positives and negatives of the growth in each area. Now, what causes people to make changes? And that change is what influences settlement patterns and movement of people and goods. There are different factors. So social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental. Social factors could be related to how well people get along, right? The interaction of different community cultures and things within an area could impact whether or not people move. The political, who's in power, what are the laws, who has rights, who's gaining rights, who's losing rights. There might be, again, conflict, and so people may choose to move based on the laws and the government in their area. Cultural, there could be cultural conflicts. There could be different belief systems in a community, and people are advocating for their culture and their rights and their voice, and that might cause conflict. There also might be oppression, where groups are treating others as worth less, and that could lead to violence, and so people are leaving because they feel that community is an unsafe place. Economy, how people earn their money. If there is no opportunity for economic growth, there's no place to get to work, you need wealth to meet your basic needs and for the quality of life of your family. So that's definitely would be a factor that might cause people to move. And environmental, it could be the natural disaster, it could be the drying up of resources, it could be climate, that idea of how well are we balancing our environment and our way of life could be a factor that results in people moving. And so this is sort of how, the cycle goes. I was trying to think of different visuals, and I'm not sure if this one works, but so at the center you have one of those factors. So it's an something that's influencing the decisions that's made by an individual. So that factor leads to action. So it could be economic, it could be social, it could be political, but it leads to an action made by a person. They make a decision, they're going to move from this place to this place. And then because of that movement, it influences the way of life in that new location where they have gone to. So if we think about, so let's say a family, there's not opportunity for economic growth or work where they live, so they decide they're going to move. They're going to move to a different urban center, a different city. Now they're included in sort of the consumers and those consumer trends of that area. So the choices where they choose to go for dinner, what they choose to buy, where they choose to live, they're all a part of that demographic now. So that might shift, right, the focus and way of life in that community. They might have a different viewpoint on how people are treated on certain laws, and they might start to advocate for that, and they might start to bring awareness, and so that might then lead to a change in a political factor or a cultural factor if there's a conflict, or if they're applying for laws to be changed. So then again we go back to that factors, which affects decisions, which then affects that impact of life. So we can see how it's sort of a constant shifting that starts with one of those 5 factors. All right, so the swelling of cities. So this movement of people in and out of cities. Technology and transportation has resulted in rapid growth in cities. Developing countries are experiencing the kind of growth that in developed countries we experienced around the 1900s. It's moving rapidly, where large densities of people are living in a small area, impacting the resources and the availability of services in those areas. So in comparison, if you think in the 1950s, 17% of those people living in developing countries lived in urban centers. And 53% of people in developed countries lived in urban centers. But the population was around 2.5 billion people. Now, with our population upwards and more than 7 billion, over 50% of people worldwide live in urban centers. So we think about that shift, that movement and that settlement of people in those urban areas and the impact that that has on rural areas, farmland, and everything else that's surrounding those cities. So here's some of the reasons why people are leaving those rural areas and moving into those urban centers. So these are called push factors in developing countries and developed countries. So in developing countries, high birth rate. So they're having more children and they're not able to meet the needs of their families in those rural settings, related to some of these other factors. So the idea in developing countries, your family would have a farm, and then every time there's children, they would divide that farm up. So your actual piece of land that you can work and make money on gets smaller and smaller and smaller with every generation. And again, with that high birth rate, you have kids to feed and you have less resources to do so. So there's decrease in opportunity for economic growth because there is this movement to the urban center. Work is leaving, and so there's less opportunities. If you can't do it on your farm, you're not being able to get another job that will then meet the needs of your family. There could be natural disasters, and because of a decreased population or because lack of resources, there's not a lot of effort to rebuild. And so just out of sheer necessity, you need to go where the resources are. And there also could be conflict. And again, if it's in a rural area, there's not resources, there's not a priority in rebuilding or protecting those areas, you have to go where those resources are. In developed countries, low birth rate, people having fewer children, means that the population in rural areas is declining. And so if you don't have the population to be consumers, to go to schools, to be patients in hospitals, those services tend to leave, which we see down here. So because the population is decreasing, there's less resources available, people are moving towards those urban centers, to have those opportunities. The farms are getting larger, and with more technology, a lot of things are being run by machines, and so fewer people are needed. So even though the farms might be bigger, there's less work because it's being done by technology. Less opportunity for economic growth, we see over here, because of that shrinking population, because of businesses moving elsewhere. A decline in services with a drop in population. People are not going to, do you need a hospital? Do you need a fire station? Do you need multiple schools? So those services start to decline, things start to close. And then this lack of excitement and entertainment. With all of these things together, without the people, you're not drawing in those industries or those cultural events or those theaters or experiences that might add to your quality of life. So people are moving to those urban centers to have those experiences.